Back in the very far ago time of 2016, there was an interesting moment where retailers during a summit stood up and told Marvel, in particular David Gabriel, that they were sick of diversity. It didn't sell and they want to know more of it. And David Gabriel seemed to admit this, saying that diversity was hurting sales and that comics were, fans didn't like it. A lot of articles ran, there was a lot of backpedaling, plenty of news was made. So what's the problem in all that? I mean, it's a horrifying statement, right? So it shouldn't be. Except none of it was actually true. Let me explain. Hey everybody, this is Perch. In 2016, a lot of news was made about Marvel admitting, quote unquote, that diversity didn't sell and people didn't want it in their comics. And they took a couple sentences and they wrote long articles about them. Places like Vox, IO9, Bleeding Cool were quick to write articles like Marvel's David Gabriel on sales slump. People didn't want any more diversity, didn't want female characters. Marvel VP of Sales blames women and diversity for sales slump. Even people like Kelly Sue DeConnick would come out and talk about how Marvel didn't support her Captain Marvel book and that they kind of left those titles on their own. Common Twitter handlers who make a lot of noise like Iron Spike, Colin Space Twinks would write things about how Marvel was dangerously going to tip away from diversity and straight white dudes don't sell and all that kind of stuff. And it was a lot of noise. But the problem is a lot of it was based on an incredibly false report. It was based on a premise that wasn't actually true. It started like many of these things do with a Bleeding Cool article where they talked about the New York City Comic-Con, and they mentioned that during it, a bunch of retailers somewhat revolted and said that they didn't want any more diversity, that women don't sell, and they described as kind of a shouting mob of old white guys who were resistant to change. And there were a couple other retailers who talked about how this ugly scene at this New York City Comic-Con was not indicative of the retailers they know. Except it's not actually true. There were some people at that New York City Comic-Con who quickly refuted the story and said that what was posted in Bleeding Cool was absolutely inaccurate. Some of the other retailers who did their this is not the business we want to be in statements admitted they weren't actually part of that summit, the ones who gave quotes in the article. And I can personally say that this description of what happened during the event was not accurate because I happened to be there. No, I wasn't one of the people shouting that women in comics had to go because nobody was shouting that women in comics had to go. That didn't happen. What did happen is that retailers were asked what they wanted to see and basically were allowed to ask some questions. And there were some remarks made, but the remarks were things like, I want you guys to entertain. That's the job. One of my customers said the other day he wants to get stories, doesn't mind the message, but he doesn't want to be beaten over the head with these things. Now, is that saying that women are not allowed in comics, that diversity is bad? There's another quote that was published in some other articles, but again, more than 9 months after the fact, long after the outrage had spun out of control, that said, when you talk about the Academy Awards and how inclusion and diversity was a prime topic, I look at the cold, hard reality and I'm in business. A lot of those movies, or other things in other media, aren't really big money makers. For me, I care about whether I'm going to sell it or not. Now, it's hard to say that that's a political statement or an anti-diversity statement. It's kind of a reality statement. A lot of the art house movies that are made that get Academy Awards are not the big budget films. And many of the points that were made at that summit, as were being made a lot during 2016, 17, and 18 at the summits I attended, use that analogy. The analogy that comics needs a assortment. They need some big blockbuster sellers, and they do need those art house books. They can't have all of one or the other. If you just have the big blockbuster comics, then what tends to happen is they get shallow. This is what people often point to happened in the 90s, and eventually the bottom drops out. If you just do the art house style indie comics or more introspective comics, you don't get the big sellers that keeps the lights on. That's common sense. That's not an argument against diversity unless you hate any kind of capitalism and making money entirely. Now, David Gabriel became the focal point to a lot of this stuff, and here's an image of David Gabriel. David Gabriel, his job is really is a VP of kind of sales and outreach. He wears a number of hats. And David Gabriel basically made a lot of comments. And his full quote was, when they talked about taste changing, when they talked about responding to the comics market, David Gabriel said, "I don't know that that's a question for me," meaning he's trying to figure out sales practices, variant things, and he mentioned, "I think it's a better question for retailers who are seeing all publishers. We heard that people didn't want any more diversity. They didn't want female characters out there. It's what we heard, whether we believe that or not. I don't know if that's really true, but that's what we saw in sales." Now, David Gabriel, in fairness, isn't exactly reflecting what the retailers were saying. He's kind of summarizing it poorly. But even David Gabriel wasn't saying the things that people quickly wrote articles saying he was doing. And by the way, this isn't David Gabriel. This is just some random guy I found on the internet. This is actually David Gabriel. Now, why did I change that up? Because that's how a lot of these articles worked. They just say, here's this guy, and here's what he said, and people believe it, and they write other articles, and they get outraged on Twitter, and they don't even bother to see if the person being shown on the screen is actually the real person we're talking about, or somebody that comes up if you type in shyster in Google. David Gabriel would go on to say, "We saw the sales of any character that was diverse, any character that was new, our female characters, anything that was not a core Marvel character, people were turning their nose up against. That was difficult for us because he had a lot of fresh, new, exciting ideas they were trying to get out, and nothing really worked." And once again, people said that statement was anti-diversity or trying to say that we just want straight white dudes in books. And again, I think it's worded poorly by David Gabriel. I don't think he was doing the best job in saying that. But his statement, anything that was not a core Marvel character, people were turning their nose up against, that's reflected in the sales. A lot of books during 2016, 2017, from America Chavez to Mosaic to the new Hawkeye, they weren't generating tons of sales. Now, I think there's another reason for that David Gabriel doesn't get into. Oh, by the way, this isn't David Gabriel either. This is just what you find in Google when you type in, dumb New York guy. This is actually David Gabriel. I think that there's some truth to saying that Marvel, as a concept, its bread and butter are the IP that are well known. And if you want to have high selling comics, you've got to build them up. You can't just roll out a brand new character like, say, Mosaic and expect it to sell 100,000 copies. And I think what nobody wrote in any of these things is that Marvel, as a publisher, was not interested in putting in the time, the effort, the marketing, and the money to actually promote these new titles and get them to be more popular. A lot of people made fun of America Chavez for the art and the story and everything else. But what they miss is that if you had put, say, I don't know, Donnie Cates wasn't working them at the time, but if you had Donnie Cates and Art Adams as a team or on America Chavez, you probably would sell a ton of America Chavez and the character would have gotten over. But you put a writer who was fairly unknown to comics and an artist that was unknown, and you wondered why it didn't pull. There's a lot of comments that get made over and over, by the way, on both sides, talking about how certain characters will and won't sell, and they miss the obvious point. It has a lot to do, the majority to do, especially with unknowns, with a creative team. If you put a world-class, top-level, recognizable creative team, writer and artist on a book, it tends to do better. It's not foolproof, but it tends to do a lot better. If you want these new characters and these new concepts to work, you have to put really great creative teams, and you have to pay them, and you have to market for them. Kelly Sue DeConnick made a statement that got, again, a lot of press because what they said was Marvel didn't bother to promote women. And She was asked, how much marketing dollars would you say Captain Marvel got while Kelly Sue DeConnick was on it? And Kelly Sue DeConnick says, $0. I paid for postcards, Carol Corps membership cards, and dog tags out of my own pocket. Now, a lot of people immediately picked that up and pointed and basically ran with the idea that, hey, this was Marvel cheating female and diversity characters. And of course they didn't work over because they didn't support them. But here's the bad news. Marvel didn't support anything. Their marketing spend on any books, whether they're diverse, straight white dudes, or robots, is terrible across the board. They tend to put dollars toward events. They tend to put dollars toward #1 issues. And by the way, Kelly Sue DeConnick is not entirely accurate here. They did put some marketing dollars to the #1 issue launch of Captain Marvel. I know this because I received posters, I received a card, I received some flyers for it, but that was it. Issue #1 got a bit. Really an insignificant amount. And she's right to be irritated, and good for her that she was paying for things out of her own pocket in order to try and promote the book. That shouldn't be the case. But while a lot of articles talked about how the company wasn't supporting these diverse female characters and they weren't supporting good creators, a better, frankly, more honest statement would have been they weren't supporting anyone at all with any kind of marketing plan. And that's the big problem. David Gabriel concludes, it was old things coming back in that time period, 3 books in particular, Spider-Man Remove Your Vows, that had Spider-Man and Mary Jane married, that worked. The Venom book worked, and the Thanos book worked. You can take what you want out of people who might be enjoying those 3 books, but it's definitely a specific type of comic book reader, comic book collector, that really liked those 3 series. They were, again, Bleeding Cool immediately jumped on that and talked about how it was pandering to homophobic straight white guys and everything else. But let's take a look at that. Spider-Man Renew Your Vows. Why did that work? Could it possibly be that fans liked continuity and liked the relationship of Spider-Man and Mary Jane, were interested to see how that worked? That after years and years and years of outrage and anger about the disillusion of their marriage and that storyline One More Day, that when they finally put something out that kind of told the other story, that fans jumped all over it? Is that in support of straight white dudes? I mean, I guess Peter is straight and white, but is that why it sold? You'd have to be insane to think that. Then they talked about the Venom book and how it worked. Okay, I guess there's a white guy in a Venom suit, but is that why they're buying it? Most of the time, Venom is a black and white Spider-Man with big teeth running around. And Venom has always sold. It's a character that has a legacy of, man, like 30 years. Is it surprising to anyone? Does anybody really think it's racism that Venom sold and say Mosaic did not? Mosaic had no history. Venom's been drawn by the biggest artist in the industry. And for this book, had a strong creative team on it. And then finally, Thanos. Are we saying Thanos is a straight white dude? I mean, I guess he's in love with death, so is that a heterosexual relationship? Is that? I mean, really? Thanos is purple. He's an alien. It's weird, and once again, like the others, he's got a 40-year history at Marvel. Is it any surprise that fans gravitate toward characters they know and have been built up for decades? I think the arrogance here at Marvel's side is to believe that they can just wave a magic wand and people will jump in and buy whatever they happen to be promoting at the time, as opposed to the fact that people tend to buy based off history, based on what they know. I find this entire process very ridiculous. And the worst part of all this is these comments were an important conversation to have. What the retailers were trying to say was not give us straight white comics. They were not saying get rid of all the women. They were not saying kill the diversity. They were trying to explain that some of these new experiments, particularly rolled out all at once with very little other option and no thought toward big blockbuster comics that were actually going to sell, was a bad idea. And you'd have to be really crazy to want to argue against that, unless you happen to want comics to stay as this underground, pathetic, tiny, non-selling thing. And there are people who do like that. They like the romance of it. But remember this when you see creators complaining about not being paid more, complaining about not being invited. Kelly Sue DeConnick made some comments about not being at the same level as some of the other people who were at the Captain Marvel movie. She was invited to the premiere, but you know why you weren't invited? You know why you weren't at that table and why you're not getting more business? Because the comic industry continues to put itself in a box. If you want it to do well, we got to support it doing well. And guess what? That does not mean all straight white comics. It means you've got to market these books. It means you've got to rely on your history. Marvel should be really proud of its diverse history. Before Captain Marvel was, this Captain Marvel, you had a different Captain Marvel, Monica Rambeau, black female. Did great. As a character, lots of history there. Marvel for years. In fact, people will tell you Marvel has always been political. That's not exactly true, but Marvel has always had political themes in their comics. They have had a very rich tapestry of diversity and male and female comics. I'll give you that they have not had a lot of LGBTQ representation in comics. Nobody has until more recently. Not at any kind of huge level. Sure, some of the Vertigo books had it. And that's something that you can grow. Great. I did a video a couple days ago about how writing gay characters, you do it well. Yeah, you've got something good on your hands. But with all this history that Marvel has, which it should be proud of, there's more than enough to leverage that, to sell books and get some properties out there. The only way you screw that up is if you ignore your history of diversity and instead you try and shoehorn in brand new concepts with no warning, no marketing, no buildup, and expect them to sell like your biggest books. That's just arrogance. The name Marvel does not equal an automatic buy. And sometimes I think Marvel forgets that. Anyway, this is an interesting story and it's bothered me for a long time. And it's why I get irritated at places like Bleeding Cool, Vox, others that, and IO9 is classic for doing this. They don't give you the story. They pull out a couple quotes, they write their own story, and then they push that on the world. To see the amount of comic creators that quote tweet and like to leverage what Bleeding Cool writes, it's terrible. They're peddling false information. Maybe they're doing it on purpose. Maybe they're doing it out of ignorance. Either way, it's awful. If you want accurate numbers, you can go to places like Comicron. You can get the history. You can also just open your eyes and your ears and listen. Find these answers out for yourself. Stop getting your news and information from shysters who you cannot trust. Those people are not out to inform you. Those people are out to tell you. And this whole story, all that happens in that process is we don't progress. There's a lot of progressives who want progress. There's a lot of people who talk about comics needing to be the forefront of new ideas and new concepts and building new value. The only way you do that is if you go into it with your eyes open and your ears open. Stop giving away your thinking to people who want clickbait. That's my opinion anyway. Hey, leave a comment below. Love to know your thoughts on this whole thing. And just, my only ask is dig a little bit. The things you think you know, you might not know. Dig a little bit. Read for yourself. View the video clips if you can. Whatever you do, make sure that the guy that's being shown on the screen is actually the guy and not just some random face pulled from Twitter, from Google. And by the way, some of you may think, oh, that's the John Oliver bit he just did. Yeah, it's true, except it's also been the case that some of these sites I've mentioned have frequently shown pictures of these people, and they're not the people. It's happened more than once. The next time it happens, I'll throw it up as a news item on the feed here on YouTube. Hey everybody, like, subscribe, share with a friend. Follow me on Twitter or Facebook at Comic Perch. Most importantly, thanks for listening.